The afternoon sun beat down on the zinc roofs of Montego Bay, sending shimmering heat waves off the asphalt of Barnett Street. Inside, Chin's hardware 3-amp building supplies. The air was cooler, thick with the scent of sawdust, rusted iron, and the sharp tang of linseed oil. 10-year-old Paul Foster didn't care about the heat. Behind a stack of cement bags, his small, lithe body was a blur of motion. Ha! He thrust a palm forward, his bare feet scuffing against the dusty floor. He pivoted, a roundhouse kick whistling through the air, narrowly missing a display of machetes. "Paul, stop that nonsense before you break down the man's store," his mother, Miss Yvonne, shouted from the back office. She was Mr. Chin's right-hand woman, the only person who could find a specific bolt in the mountain of inventory faster than the owner himself. Mr. Chin, a man whose face was a map of 80 years of hard work and hidden stories, stepped out from behind the counter. He adjusted his spectacles and looked at the boy. Paul was small for his age, but his eyes were ancient, dark, focused, and burning with a strange intensity. "Little Foster," Mr. Chin said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "This is a hardware store. We sell zinc, we sell nail, we sell lumber. We do not sell flying kicks. It is not a place for this." Paul stopped mid-stance, his chest heaving. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of a dusty hand. "Why you always punching the air, boy?" Mr. Chin asked, leaning against a crate of red stripe. "Who you fighting? The ghost them?" Paul looked Mr. Chin straight in the eyes. There was no defiance in his gaze, only a heavy, desperate truth. "Kung Fu is in me, Mr. Chin. It feel like a fire in my bones. I don't know how to let it out the right way." The boy hesitated, then took a step forward. "Sir, do you know Kung Fu?" Mr. Chin didn't answer. He simply turned back to his ledger, his expression unreadable. For the next week, Paul obeyed. He stayed outside the store, practicing on the cracked sidewalk under the shade of a mango tree. He watched the way the birds moved, the way the stray dogs balanced, trying to mimic the flow of nature. Every day, through the darkened glass of the storefront, Mr. Chin watched him. He saw the boy's natural grace, but he also saw the chaos in his movements. Paul had the spirit, but he lacked the map. On Friday evening, as the shadows of the Blue Mountains stretched toward the sea, Mr. Chin called Paul inside. Miss Yvonne had already left to catch the bus, leaving Paul to wait for her to return with the truck. The store was quiet. Mr. Chin reached into a locked wooden cabinet behind the register and pulled out a bundle wrapped in fading yellow silk. He placed it on the counter. "I see you outside," Mr. Chin said softly. "You have the hunger. But hunger without a spoon is just an empty belly." He unwrapped the silk to reveal a book. Its cover was dark, weathered leather, and the pages were made of thin, rice paper parchment. The title was written in bold, elegant brushstrokes of black ink. "This was my grandfather's," Mr. Chin said. "It is written in the old tongue. I was going to translate the first few Tuadadong," Paul whispered. Mr. Chin froze. His hand, reaching for a notepad to begin translating, stopped midair. He looked at the boy, then at the book, then back at the boy. Mr. Chin breathed. Paul traced the characters with a trembling finger. "It says the flow of qi, the way of the internal breath." Mr. Chin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. "Paul, how can you read those marks? No one taught you Chinese. Your mother says you spend all your time at the library reading about the Shaolin, but those books are in English." Paul looked up, confused by Mr. Chin's shock. "I don't know, sir. I see the pictures in the words. It's like I remember them from a dream. The shapes make sense to me." Mr. Chin pulled a wooden stool over and sat down heavily. He realized then that the boy hadn't been lying. The Kung Fu wasn't just in him. It was an inheritance of the soul. "Open it," Mr. Chin commanded, his voice trembling slightly. Paul opened the manual to the first page. There was an illustration of a man standing in a horse stance with red lines tracing the meridians of the body. "The breath begins in the dantian, 2 inches below the navel," Paul read aloud, his voice taking on a rhythmic, chanting quality. "It must rise like the mist off the doctor's cave beach and settle like the stone of the mountain. To strike is to exhale, to live is to inhale." Mr. Chin closed his eyes. He hadn't heard those words spoken with such perfect inflection since he was a child in the Guangdong province, watching his own father practice in the moonlight. "Mr. Chin," Paul asked, breaking the silence, "is this why you moved to Jamaica, to hide the book?" Mr. Chin opened his eyes. The stoic hardware store owner was gone. In his place was a man who had finally found the person he had been waiting for his entire life. "I moved here to survive, Paul," Mr. Chin said. "I thought the flow had stopped with me. I thought the modern world had no room for the old ways." He stood up, walked to the front door, and flipped the sign to closed. He slid the heavy iron bolt into place. "Kung Fu is not just in you, Paul Foster," Mr. Chin said, his stance shifting, his feet turning out, his spine straightening, his hands rising into a perfect, effortless guard. "It is a conversation between your spirit and the world. Since you can read the map, I suppose it is time I taught you how to walk the path." In the dim light of the hardware store, surrounded by hammers and nails, the old man from China and the young boy from Montego Bay began a journey that would turn a dusty shop into the most secret dojo in the Caribbean. "Again," Mr. Chin said, his eyes glowing. "From the beginning. Read the second line, then show me your heart." The training transformed the hardware store into a sanctuary of stillness. Every evening, after the last customer had bought their bags of cement and the heavy iron shutters were rolled down, the air changed. Mr. Chin no longer sat behind the counter. He stood in the center of the aisle, his feet rooted to the concrete floor like an ancient cedar. Paul stood opposite him, mirroring his every move. "The book is a map, Paul," Mr. Chin said, his voice echoing off the zinc roofing. "But the map is not the mountain. You read the words, 'strike like the crane.' But your eyes are looking at the paper. You must look through the paper. Feel the air around your hand. Feel the weight of the sea breeze pushing against your skin. The chi is not in the ink. It is in the space between the atoms." For 2 weeks, they didn't throw a single punch. Instead, Mr. Chin made Paul stand in the Mabu the horse stance for hours. He placed a bowl of water on each of Paul's thighs and one on his head. "If a drop falls, the flow is broken," Mr. Chin warned. "You must become the hardware store itself, solid, unmoving, silent." Paul's legs shook. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. But as he looked at the old manual, he began to see the characters differently. They weren't just instructions, they were pulses. He started to breathe in time with the flickering of the fluorescent light overhead. He felt the vibration of the refrigerator in the back, the distant hum of the Montego Bay traffic, and the slow, steady heartbeat of Mr. Chin. 2 days later, Paul closed the book. He didn't look exhausted, he looked troubled. "Mr. Chin," Paul said softly, his voice sounding older than his 10 years. "Yes, little Foster, this book. The flow of chi. It stops," Paul said, his fingers tracing the frayed edges of the last page. "It teaches how to gather the energy, how to move it through the arms and the legs, how to breathe with the earth." Mr. Chin nodded. "It is the foundation of our style, the internal gate." "No, sir," Paul said, looking up with eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light of the shop. "It's half of a conversation. There is another book. I can feel the silent words at the end of this one calling out to it. This book is about the flow, but the other one is about the source." Mr. Chin's breath hitched. He slowly sat down on a crate of galvanized nails. "What are you saying, Paul?" "It's not here," Paul continued, his gaze drifting toward the darkened window. "It's not in Jamaica. It's not even in your cabinet, but it finishes what this one starts. Without it, the chi we gather has nowhere to go. It just sits inside us like a storm that can't rain." Mr. Chin's hands trembled. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, faded photograph cracked at the edges. It showed 2 identical books resting on a silk pillow in a temple he hadn't seen in 60 years. "My father told me a story when we fled the mainland," Mr. Chin whispered. "He said the manual of the 2 sons was split during the revolution. One half stayed with our family. The other, the Book of the Source, was taken by the White Lotus Society. I thought it was a legend. I thought my father told me that just to make our book seem more important." Paul shook his head. "It's real, Mr. Chin. I can see the characters in my head. They look like the ones in this book, but they're inverted. Like a reflection in the Great River." Paul walked over to a dusty chalkboard Mr. Chin used for tallies. He picked up a piece of chalk and, with a hand that moved with terrifying fluid grace, drew a single, complex Chinese character that wasn't in the manual. Mr. Chin stood up, his face pale. That is the character for void. It hasn't been used in that context for 300 years. "It's the first word of the second book," Paul said. "We have to find it, sir. Because as I learned this," he gestured to the manual, "the fire in my bones is getting hotter. If I don't learn how to release it, I think it will consume me." Mr. Chin looked at the young boy, then at the character on the board. He realized that Paul wasn't just a student, he was a seeker. The boy's inexplicable ability to read the ancient tongue wasn't a gift, it was a summons. "The White Lotus moved their archives to a hidden vault in the new territories of Hong Kong," Mr. Chin said, his voice hardening with a new purpose. "I am an old man, Paul. I have spent 40 years hiding in a hardware store in St. James. I thought I was done with the world of the fist." He walked to the door and locked it with 3 separate keys. He turned to Paul. "We will finish this manual in 3 months, Mr. Chin declared. You will learn every strike, every breath, and every meditation. And then, we are going to close the store. I will tell your mother we are going on a busyness trip to source new tools." Paul smiled, a fierce, determined expression. "And what tools are we looking for, Mr. Chin?" Mr. Chin looked at the boy's hands. "The kind that can open the gates of the soul. Paul, we are going to find the source." For the next 3 months, the hardware store on Barnett Street transformed from a place of commerce into a crucible. Mr. Chin pushed Paul past the limits of a normal child. He made the boy practice his strikes against heavy bags of dry concrete until his knuckles were like iron. He made him balance on the sharp edges of upturned timber, teaching him that the flow was most powerful when the body was at its most precarious. But the most strange thing was the heat. As Paul mastered the manual, the air around him would begin to shimmer. When he practiced his palm of the rising tide, the sawdust on the floor would begin to swirl in perfect geometric patterns, caught in a localized cyclone. "Control it, Paul," Mr. Chin would shout, his eyes wide with a mixture of pride and terror. "If the chi leaks, it is wasted. Keep it in the bone. Keep it in the marrow." One evening, Miss Yvonne walked into the store and stopped dead. She saw Paul standing in the center of the aisle, his eyes closed. A heavy iron sledgehammer was levitating 3 inches off the counter, vibrating in rhythm with her son's breathing. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, dropping her keys. The hammer fell with a thunderous clang. Paul gasped, his eyes snapping open. Mr. Chin stepped forward, his expression grave. "Yvonne, sit down, we have to talk." He told her a version of the truth that Paul was a natural scholar of an ancient lineage, and that there was a lost library in Hong Kong that held the key to his condition. He promised her that Paul would be safe, that he would pay for everything, and that they were going to source specialized inventory that would secure their future. Yvonne looked at her son. She saw the way his skin seemed to glow, the way the restless, hyperactive boy had become a pillar of calm. She didn't understand kung fu, but she understood her son. "He is not a normal boy anymore, is he, Mr. Chin?" she asked softly. "No, Yvonne," Mr. Chin replied. "He is something the world hasn't seen in a long time." A week later, Paul and Mr. Chin stepped off a plane at Chek Lap Kok Airport in Hong Kong. The transition from the slow, salt air rhythm of Montego Bay to the neon-drenched vertical chaos of Hong Kong was jarring. To Paul, the city didn't just look different, it felt different. In Jamaica, the energy was wide and green. Here, the chai was compressed, squeezed between skyscrapers and millions of racing hearts. "It is so loud," Paul whispered, rubbing his temples as they moved through the crowded streets of Kowloon. "The city is a drum, Paul," Mr. Chin said, gripping his cane. "Do not let it play you. You must play the drum." They stayed in a cramped, hidden apartment above a tea shop in the New Territories. Mr. Chin began making inquiries in the back rooms of mahjong parlors, reaching out to the ghosts of his past. On their 3rd night, Paul woke up in a cold sweat. He didn't say a word. He stood up, walked to the window, and pointed toward a dark fog-shrouded mountain in the distance. "It is there," Paul said, "the source. It's crying out." "Someone is trying to open it, Mr. Chin, but they don't have the first book. They're trying to force the lock." Mr. Chin's face went pale. "The White Lotus. If they try to draw from the source without the flow to balance it, they will trigger a huzak, a pillar of fire. They'll level half the territory." "We have to go now," Paul said. They traveled by foot, moving through the forested outskirts of the city. As they climbed the hidden stone stairs of the mountain, Paul's movements became more fluid, more predatory. He wasn't the boy from the hardware store anymore. He was a vessel of the ancient way. They reached the gates of an old, seemingly abandoned monastery. But the air was hummed with high-frequency energy. 2 guards in modern black tactical gear, but carrying traditional Guandao polearms, stepped out of the shadows. "The White Lotus does not accept visitors," one said in Cantonese. Paul stepped forward. He didn't look at the guards. He looked at the gate. He spoke in the ancient dialect of the manual, a language that shouldn't have existed for centuries. "The river returns to the mountain. The breath returns to the lung. Open the way or be swept aside by the tide." The guards laughed, but their laughter died when Paul raised his hand. He didn't strike. He simply exhaled. A wave of pure kinetic energy, invisible but devastating, slammed into the heavy reinforced steel doors. The bolts sheared off like paper. The doors groaned and flew off their hinges, crashing into the courtyard beyond. Mr. Chin stared at the boy's back. "Paul, that was the 7th gate strike. You haven't even read that chapter yet." "I didn't need to," Paul said, his voice echoing with a strange, double-toned resonance. "The manual told me how to move. The mountain is telling me why." They entered the courtyard to find a circle of 12 monks in white robes surrounding a pedestal. On that pedestal sat a book that looked exactly like Mr. Chin's, but its leather was white, and it pulsed with a faint, rhythmic golden light. In front of the pedestal stood a man with long silver hair and eyes as cold as a winter moon, Master Wei, the leader of the White Lotus. "So," Wei said, looking at the young Jamaican boy in his dusty sneakers and jeans, "the half-manual has found a voice. I have spent 40 years trying to decode the source, and here comes a child who carries the key in his blood." Wei raised a hand, and the 12 monks moved into fighting stances. "Mr. Chin," Paul said, not taking his eyes off the white manual. "Remember when you said the hardware store wasn't a place for kung fu? Mr. Chin gripped his cane, his old muscles coiling with power he hadn't used since the revolution. I remember, little Foster. You were wrong, Paul said, his hands beginning to glow with a soft blue light. Everywhere is a place for kung fu, because the flow is everywhere. Paul Foster took a single step forward, and the ground beneath the monastery began to tremble. The busyness trip was over. The battle for the soul of the world had begun. The 12 monks moved as one, a white tide of silk and precision. They didn't strike like street brawlers. They moved in the lotus petal formation, an interlocking web of strikes designed to trap and crush. Paul, the circle of 3 defense, Mr. Chin roared. The old man's cane hummed as he spun it, parrying 2 polearms with a speed that defied his 80 years. Don't fight their strength. Divert the river. Paul didn't move. He stood in the center of the courtyard, his eyes half closed. To the monks he looked like a defenseless child. To Paul the world had turned into a map of glowing lines. He could see the heat in the monks' lungs, the tension in their tendons, and the frantic, jagged pulse of Master Wei's ego. The first 3 monks lunged. Paul didn't block. He pivoted on a dime, the Kingston shuffle he'd practiced on the cracked sidewalk of Barnett Street. He moved through the tiny gaps in their formation, his hands blurred. Tap, tap. Tap, he touched their pressure points with the lightness of a butterfly. The monks collapsed instantly, their limbs turning to jelly. They weren't injured, but their chi had been locked by a child who understood their bodies better than they did. Impossible, Master Wei hissed, his silver hair whipping in the wind. The heavenly lock takes 50 years to master. It's not hard, Paul said, his voice strangely calm. You just have to stop shouting at the energy and start listening to it. Wei snarled and stepped forward. He didn't use a weapon. He raised his palms, and the air between them began to glow with a sickly, jagged violet light. This was the source without the flow, pure raw power without any direction. It was a vacuum that sucked the heat out of the air. You speak of listening. Wei laughed, a sound like breaking glass. I have heard the source, boy. It speaks of dominion. It speaks of the fire that forged the stars. Wei unleashed a blast of violet energy. Paul, move, Mr. Chin cried, throwing himself flat. But Paul didn't move. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the old dark manual, The Flow of Qi. He held it up like a shield. The violet blast hit the book. Instead of burning it, the energy was absorbed. The dark leather began to pulse with a deep oceanic blue light. The 2 manuals, one in Paul's hand, one on the pedestal, began to hum in a harmonic frequency that made the very stones of the monastery vibrate. The white manual on the pedestal flew into the air, drawn to its twin. No, Wei screamed, leaping to intercept it. Paul jumped. He didn't use his muscles. He used the rising chi of the mountain. He soared 15 feet into the air, his hand snatching the white manual just as it reached the peak of its flight. As his fingers touched the white leather, a massive shockwave of golden light erupted from the center of the courtyard. The fog vanished. The clouds above the mountain parted, revealing a star-strewn sky. Paul landed softly, holding both books. He stood in a perfect cross-legged position, the dark book in his left hand, the white book in his right. The manual of the 2 sons, Mr. Chin whispered, tears streaming down his face. It is whole again. Wei scrambled to his feet, his face twisted in a mask of rage. He lunged at Paul, his hands clawed like a demon's. Give it to me. That power belongs to the White Lotus. Paul didn't look up. He brought the 2 books together. Clap. The sound wasn't loud, but it felt like a heartbeat that echoed through every soul in the city below. Paul's eyes opened. They were no longer dark. They were 2 points of pure, golden light. He spoke, but it wasn't the voice of a 10-year-old boy from Montego Bay. It was a voice that sounded like the wind and the sea. The flow finds the source. The source finds the flow. The storm is over. He pushed his hands forward. A wave of warm, golden energy, not a strike, but a release, washed over Master Wei. The violet, jagged light in Wei's body was extinguished. The silver-haired man fell to his knees, gasping. He wasn't dead, but his stolen power was gone. He was just an old man again, facing the silence of his own heart. The remaining monks dropped their weapons and bowed low, their heads touching the stone. The golden light faded. Paul's eyes returned to their normal brown. He slumped forward, his small body suddenly exhausted. Mr. Chin caught him before he hit the ground. I did it, Mr. Chin, Paul whispered, his voice shaky and young again. I let it out. You did more than that, Paul, Mr. Chin said, hugging the boy close. You brought the world back into balance. A week later, the busyness trip ended. Paul and Mr. Chin stepped off the plane back in Jamaica. The air was hot, humid, and smelled of jerk chicken and sea salt. Miss Yvonne was waiting at the airport in her old Toyota. She hugged Paul so hard he thought his ribs would crack. You look different, Paul. You look taller. I just learned a lot about tools, Mommy, Paul said, glancing at Mr. Chin. They drove back to Montego Bay. As they passed the hardware store on Barnett Street, Paul saw the closed sign. "We opening back up tomorrow, Mr. Chin?" Paul asked. Mr. Chin looked at the boy, then at the 2 books tucked safely away in Paul's bag. He thought of the mountain in Hong Kong, and then he looked at the vibrant, colorful chaos of St. James. "The store will stay a hardware store, Paul," Mr. Chin said with a wink. "People still need nails and zinc. But the back room, I think we need to clear out those old cement bags." "Why, sir?" "Because," Mr. Chin said, straightening his back and looking out at the Caribbean Sea, "a master of the 2 suns needs a place to practice, and I think I'm finally ready to be a student again." Paul laughed, a bright, happy sound that drifted out the car window. He looked at his hands. They didn't glow anymore, but he could feel it, the steady, rhythmic flow of the universe moving through him like a song he finally knew the words to. The kung fu was out, and the world would never be the same.
Respect for watching. Thank you for stepping into the world of Jamaican connection. We're honored to have you on this journey. We are just getting started. If you felt the beat today, here is how you can join the movement. Strike the like button. It helps our story reach more warriors across the globe. Join the clan, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a beat. Drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? Stay tuned, stay lethal, and stay connected. One heart, one strike, Jamaican connection.